and welcome to Tanya Online and Positivity Show. It is my absolute pleasure and delight to introduce this guest to you, and it's someone that I met through one of my clients actually, part of the project that he decided to lead. He enrolled and inspired and invited my client to get involved, and I'll share a little bit more about that in a moment. And that's actually the reason that we're meeting today. I'd like to introduce you to Victor Perton, who is the lead or the creator and founder of the Australian Leadership Project and the author of The Case for Optimism. And welcome to Positivity Show, Victor.
Oh, thank you, Tanya. I so enjoy your vibrancy, and I follow your Facebook group and see so many interesting and positive posts on a daily basis. So it's a great pleasure to be talking to you by video conference across the bay.
I know, it's wonderful. We're in Melbourne, and technology is fantastic, and I know that you've got lots happening at the moment, so I really appreciate you joining me. If we can perhaps jump into the end, I wanted to share with my business audience and the leaders that I work with and people in my community the work that you're doing, because obviously we're aligned with positivity and the optimism, but perhaps share the journey for the book, and then we can chat about the aspect of the blog and so on and how we met. I'd love to hear about the story of how the book came about.
So the Australian Leadership Project has consumed a lot of my time for the last year, trying to work out why Australian language is so negative around leadership and why perceptions of leaders are so negative. And in the midst of that, I'm also on the board of the Global Integrity Summit. And as you can imagine, the Global Integrity Summit proceedings tend to be a little on the negative side. You've got prisoners of conscience, journalists who've been imprisoned, tales of corruption, people's efforts to defeat that corruption, discussions on transparency and the like. And every board meeting, I do my usual thing, which I can imagine you do on your boards, is I'd say the world is not that bad. There are good things happening, and I'd share some stories. And so last year the board said, okay, well, why don't we do a panel to end the conference, 3:30 in the afternoon on Friday, a panel for the case of optimism.
Wow.
Now, even an optimist would have doubts about the number of people at 3:30 on a pleasant Friday afternoon in Brisbane. Yeah. But there were 550 people present. The questions were coming via Twitter at almost 2 a second. And there was a vibrancy. People hung around. The questions were not trivial. There were questions about how do I make myself more positive, or I'm the positive person at work, but I'm ridiculed for it, or I've got a difficult person round the table, what do I do about them? And my mother is 89 and a very great optimist herself, and still teaching, and she said, Victor, your paper is too good to leave on the floor of a conference. Wow. And so why don't you turn it into a book? Wonderful. And so with that initiation, I turned it into a book. We published in December. And it's gone really, really well globally. To my surprise, very good in paperback, even more so than ebook. It looks like paperback's on the way back, and people are enjoying reading it. And a lot of people read it, a page or two. I had one fellow write to me the other day and say, I read a page every day and I share a quote in every speech that I make. So my mother's advice, which was, don't leave it on the conference floor, publish it, was very good, very optimistic, and very prescient.
Wow, fantastic. So I'm really interested in, the negative language. I wouldn't mind us having a conversation about that, and perhaps this is where our worlds collide. And I know in a lot of the leadership work that I've been doing for the last, I think it's 22 years now, and along the journey, actually, I met Melissa. And at the time that I met Melissa was a very different person. That would have been around 18 years ago. And then on her journey, she tracked me down. And in the last probably 4 years, approached me and said, look, I really am going through a lot of change, and I would really like some support on my own leadership journey. And so we did some pretty intense work and I mentored her, and then she has made some amazing headway, and I know that that's how you guys met, and then you brought me into the group. So I'd love to understand how you came to meet Melissa and her work.
So the story goes back further. I was, as a young man, I became a member of the state parliament in Victoria. Okay. And I had 18 splendid years. I won 6 elections, and it was a lovely, very interesting life working at the cutting edge of public policy, e-government, conservation, environment. But after 18 years, I'd had enough. And so I retired, set up my own consultancy in regulatory affairs, and then was asked to become Commissioner to the Americas, Trade Commissioner. Okay. And so my work for 3 years in the United States was to promote foreign direct investment into Australia and into Victoria particularly, and also to support exporters entering the American markets. And everywhere I went, there was this astonishing positivity around Australian leadership and Australians, which made my work so easy. I got to the United States in the middle of the global financial crisis, and everyone thought I'd been given the ultimate hospital pass, which I think works in both Australian football and rugby. And it was quite the opposite. I remember the chairman of Caterpillar, I went to Peoria to see him, saying, "You Aussies remind me of the Americans of 100 years ago. Nothing is impossible." The Secretary General of the Brazil Olympics said to me, "I only have 2 aspirations. One is to have an Olympic Games as good as Sydney 2000 and a legacy as good as Melbourne 1956. The Melbourne was the host in 56, and the assets still make Melbourne one of the world's sporting capitals." This was replicated not just in Boeing and Pfizer and Alcoa, but also, when you were in a roadside cafe and the truck drivers would hear you speaking and would say, "Well, I love that Foster's Lager of yours." And so 3 years flashed by. We were promoting all sorts of marvellous Australian exports. And then I had a quite unique opportunity. Okay. If I thought being a member of parliament was interesting and then being trade commissioner was interesting, I then had the opportunity to serve Joe Hockey and then later the Prime Minister as senior advisor on engagement in the G20 presidency, which was described as the most important political meeting Australia has ever hosted, and Brisbane did a splendid job as the host city. Anyway, at the end of that, for personal reasons, I came back to Melbourne, and Melbourne's a prosperous city. There's no problem getting work. There's no problem doing interesting things. But I was astonished by the level of negativity expressed by people, not just about leadership, but about life itself. And yet, this country is number 1 on the United Nations Development Index, number 1 on the OECD Good Life Index. 5 of our cities are in the top 15 in the Economist ranking of cities. 6 of our cities in the top 40 on the Mercer ranking of cities. No people on earth have ever lived better than the Australians of today. And yet, if you listen to the public rhetoric on the news and on television, you hear people's conversations, you'd think we were some sort of hellhole, as Mr. Trump used a slightly different expression recently. And so I was perplexed by this. And there were a number of really crazy surveys that came out from universities and organisations that said Australian leadership was hopeless and management was hopeless. But I looked at the questions and they were all biased in order to achieve a negative result. So I thought, rather than complain about the complainers, I do an experiment myself and ask people, what are the unique qualities of Australian leadership? What do Australians want of their leaders today? And ask them their favourite stories of Australian leadership. And Melissa was referred to me, and we had a wonderful conversation. She's very public in that she has undergone sex change. And in doing that, she wanted to speak out for people in her position. And Tanya, to hear Melissa speak about your work and your inspiration, you've helped to underpin her leadership and her confidence. So it's a long way of getting to the fact that I met Melissa because I wanted to ask her about what are the unique qualities of Australian leadership? Who did she admire? What did she want of her leaders? And certainly you fit the bill as a great muse, a great mentor of people going through leadership journeys and becoming better leaders. And you should be very proud of the work that you're doing.
Oh, wow, thank you. I feel very privileged with that. An amazing set of circumstances to line up what we're talking about, because that's a similar experience, you know, in terms of language and in terms of what the dialogue and the conversations that do happen. It does happen, you know, in the workplaces and in families, and the inner dialogue that we have inside ourselves and our experiences. And my hope, even for the work in the positive workplace stuff that I'm doing and the positive leadership stuff, the group that, you know, you're part of, the positive business people, was all about creating awareness in terms of dialogue, inner dialogue with ourselves, the dialogue in our conversations at home, dialogue, you know, with our families, our communities, and our workplaces. And then, you know, from a leadership standpoint, those leaders owning and understanding that their vibe really does attract the tribe. And I love the cachet and the weight that you're putting on this, you know, in terms of really shining a light on it with this optimism work. So thank you for the acknowledgement, and I feel really grateful that we are, you know, now speaking. So tell us a little bit about your work and the types of things you're doing. You mentioned a keynote earlier. You've got your book and your consulting. So how have you translated your experiences to what you're up to now? And you've got a very big community on LinkedIn. Would love to hear about, you know, what you're doing in your processes and impact.
Well, I'm going through a transition, and sorry about knocking the microphone. So the optimism side is unexpected. The Australian Leadership Project's gone really, really well. We've done 1,000 interviews in the first year. People are interested. People like Tracy Izard have, you know, lifted large portions and included them in their book, and have now described us as the treasure trove of Australian leadership material. So one of the demands from that community is that I translate some of that into book form so it's more easily used. And what I'm doing is also empowering schools and universities. I'm going out to one of the universities in a couple of weeks again. I gave a keynote address at the RMIT MBA retreat 3 weekends ago. So that people really understand what it is to be an Australian leader. And, you know, the three unique qualities of Australian leadership are exactly what you preach. Egalitarianism. You know, in Australia, you speak as an equal to everyone. And it's very important. You don't win leadership in Australia by title. You really win it by performance and the confidence of your team. Humour is really important in Australia. We're one of the few countries in the world where you can tell jokes at board meetings. And Graham Mitchell, you know, the scientist, said to me, well, when we entered the World Health Organization meetings, the room would light up because anyone can give a speech about a molecule, but only Australians can do it with humour. And then the third attribute of Australian leadership that is relatively unique is authenticity, or what we call no bullshit. Australians have got very advanced bullshit meters. And so it's very important that a leader speaks clearly and plainly. And John Lloyd, who's the Public Service Commissioner in Canberra, says that Australians can be excruciatingly plain speaking. Yes. Or Pitt Marlowe, who was the head of Microsoft here, said, you know, her colleagues in America would find it quite confronting, you know, to have the country manager being so plain speaking. That's very much so. So I anticipated that the next 30 years of my life would be continuing to advance the cause, and my ambition, working with people who are also enthusiastic and automating it and the like, is to have 1 million people do the Australian Leadership Interview, because it's both a reflective practice and a gratitude practice, because we ask the question, who have been the leaders in your life, who has inspired you? And for people to hear that expression said of them, you know, as in your case was said of you, really makes people feel good. But the optimism side has really taken off, and I've done, I think, 5 keynote speeches, including 2 large corporates in the last fortnight. One of the largest companies in the country has asked me to keynote their 2030 strategy retreat. So I'm doing quite a lot of that, motivating people, helping people, now working with sales teams, because optimism is so much a part of that process, you know, of selling something. So I'm working with Sue Barrett, who I think you know. You know, we're actually producing some really good retreats for sales teams, because in Australia, it's a really funny thing. Everyone wants to be in marketing, but very few people want to describe themselves as being in sales. But one of the things I learnt in the USA was it is all about sales, and you know, my job there was selling the Australian dream.
Yeah, wow, that's really amazing work, particularly linking it into the sales dialogue. And you know, you talked before a little bit about keeping it simple, the no bullshit, that kind of thing. Some of the stuff that you've probably picked up on that we talk about is speak like a 7-year-old, and it's all about that, you know, connecting and making sure that that leader is heard and is communicating and their messages and is understood, but is pitching it at a level that is very consumable, that people really get it and they don't feel alienated, or they don't feel like they're being put down or, you know, or played with or anything like that, so that, you know, we can execute and we can get things done. I would love to know what's next for you. So you're doing the sales stuff, you're doing the keynotes. Have you explored the online world? So are you doing any online education, or are you doing more live retreats and events? Or how are you going to get this message out there? And there's a method in my madness of why I'm asking the question, but I'm very interested in this is very important work, and it's big ripple effects. So, you know, reaching that million people through the articles. But have you got another strategy or path for utilising online and digital?
Yeah, so the person-to-person is really important. So I've got an invitation to go to a Middle Eastern country shortly, because they've got that same issue. Also a Pacific Island state. So face-to-face remains very important. People want to feel you, they want to talk to you, they want to have conversations. But I've been very strong in digital since the 90s, that is the 1990s.
Yes.
And I hosted the first online forum for the World Bank. I held the first electronic town hall in Australia. So I've been experimenting. I was one of the very early LinkedIn clients in Australia. So my online strategy, I use LinkedIn. I've got a personal account there. And I also have a very strong group, of which you are a member, in the Australian Leadership Group. And all of your listeners are welcome to join. You know, it's free. There's great material posted several times a week. There are people adding material. We also use Facebook. And we haven't set up a group in Facebook. I haven't felt the need to do that. But the page gets a lot of work. So, for instance, we posted today an article by a Pakistani professor talking about optimism in the meeting between the Afghan and Pakistani presidents. So we used advertising to get greater pull for that post in Pakistan and Afghanistan. We've done another one we did today. I'm just trying to remember what country it was. It was a United States post. But it was from a community in northern Michigan. So again, we used not just a Facebook post, but Facebook advertising. We used Twitter a lot. I like Twitter. And we've got, there's both accounts for the Australian Leadership Project and the Optimism Project on Twitter. And we use YouTube, although not as much. I've in preparing for this interview with you, I've watched your videos, and I really admire the effervescent and positive way you do that. And so I've been wrestling with the use of YouTube. And in fact, I'd only used Zoom once before this interview. And in fact, I may copy you, the best form of flattery,
Yes.
and maybe do more of my interviews via Zoom,
Absolutely.
rather than by telephone or by text.
Yes. What I find, Victor, in doing them like this is that we can split off the audio and we can use that as a podcast, and then we can upload them like this. And where I was going with this, and maybe it's another discussion that we can have, that through our project, the Positive Workplace certification. So through my work at Intercept, I found similarly to you. So I've been doing this myself and my team have been doing one-on-one work for a very long time. Entrepreneurs, executives, big corporates like Cummins Engine Company, New Balance, Mercedes-Benz. So some very, big international brands. And then we found this sort of split-off theme where we were doing a lot of expert facilitation, teaching and training within the business. But we observed this language piece, which, you spoke to earlier. So positive workplace certification, positive leadership is a big piece of work. I'm actually going to Dubai at the end of this month to go and do a piece of work with Mercedes-Benz HR and do positive communication workshop there. And it's about the dialogue. And where I wanted to link it back to you is that we've created a domain name, Positivity Hub, and we want to set up a big resource for content that is all of this nature. And so perhaps that's a good opportunity for you to be also linking your interviews, and us cross-linking the message, because I just feel it's very, very big work, and, we model collaboration because that's one of the features of, positive communication. So love to explore that, or, you putting your content, you're making it available for companies. Sometimes I've found the leaders and will do retreats, and they will do offsites, and they'll have conferences, and they'll invest heavily in themselves at that leadership, that MBA level. That transmitting the message down the line. You talk about sales teams, but the finance teams, the operations teams, and the front line people, and them having access to this kind of content, with the messaging and so on, and maybe even with what Sue's doing. I see it as a huge opportunity. And as we're connecting with people all around the world. The thing that I love with the optimism piece, I have a bit of trouble with the positivity word, because some people think that we're tackling this from a euphoric way. It's not euphoric. It's actually a discipline. And you mentioned earlier, your mother being a yoga teacher. Where did you get first exposed to, the discipline of optimism, or you really strike me as someone that, really is present. You have a very positive disposition, naturally, and you are glass half full. I can see that. What were your influences around that? Was it mainly your mum, or did you read, or through your intense career you had to consciously create discipline for your optimism levels? Like how did you keep yourself that glass half full?
That is a brilliant question, because positive language is vital. So let me split it into two. Let me answer your second question, then come back to the first question.
It's very long.
In respect of my own optimism, my parents were refugees, stateless refugees, when they arrived in Australia in 1950. My father's father had been tortured to death by the Soviets. My grandmother had disappeared to the gulags, and my father didn't even know his mother was alive again until the mid-50s. Although she herself, I finally met her in 1987. I then met her every year till her death. She told me she would outlive communism. And a woman in her late 80s with ill health saying she would outlive communism when the Soviet Union looked so strong was a model of optimism herself. So I think I've been blessed genetically. My mother was widowed when I was very young, so I didn't have the opportunity of a father's influence beyond early childhood. So I think she was a very, very strong influence. And then I'm also blessed with a natural curiosity. So one of the influences was the Brahma Kumaris. So even though on a religious basis, I'm Catholic, I really enjoy meditating with a women-led Hindu sect, the Brahma Kumaris, who also have a very positive message. I like the work of Tim Sharp and the Happiness Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney, and I did his certificate of positive psychology coaching. I love the work of Martin Seligman, the positive psychology leader out of the University of Pennsylvania, who's had a strong influence here in Australia through Geelong Grammar and then Thinker in Residence. There's a centre at Berkeley University on positive living, which was again another influence on me. And then these days, every morning, my discipline is my first half hour of reading and my clippings on optimism and positivity.
Great.
So when we come back to language, I now, when I ask someone at the checkout in the supermarket, how are you? And they say, not too bad. I say, well, what does that mean?
It's great.
It's one of those Australian expressions that really drags people down. So, so I've been very blessed, both through genetic and conditioning and a personal curiosity, and now, daily discipline. I meditate. Those of your listeners who don't meditate, I'd strongly recommend it. You don't need to follow a religious side of these things. Peter Wilson wrote some very good pop meditation books a few years ago called The Quiet and the Calm. For any businessman or businesswoman who's a bit embarrassed, putting on sackcloth or the like to meditate, Peter's books offer a good way of getting there. But most importantly, it's using positive language. So my tweets almost every day now, I set out the challenge for people to say, use the expression, I am optimistic about. Ask your team, what are you optimistic about? This morning, standing on the pier at Port Melbourne, a lady was walking past me with a camera and we got into conversation. I said, what are you optimistic about? And she just lit up as I asked her the question and told me about her work in safety and occupational health and safety and rehabilitating workers. So interesting, come back to language and leadership. After a year and a half of studying Australian views on leadership, I think maybe the word leader or leadership is the problem.
I agree.
Australians don't like to call themselves leaders. They don't like the attribute of leadership. They're quite happy to be called the boss or call someone the boss, and it's affectionate. The other thing is I subscribe to a philosophy of Martin Parkinson, who's the head of the Prime Minister's Department, and he says to his teams, the leader looks like the person in your mirror. So I think there's no one up, there's no one down. If I can share one anecdote, when I was working on the G20, we had a meeting in Cairns. And I always wake up for the dawn, and I was walking at 5 a.m, and there were two guys cleaning the streets. And I went up to them and he said, look, I work for the Treasurer. I really want to thank you for what you're doing in making the city ready for the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. And this guy, burnt by the sun, I reckon 7 or 8 teeth in his mouth. He looks at me, smiles and says, you tell Jo she'll be schmick. So there's someone, that you would think, a cleaner of the streets demonstrating Australian leadership. So I'll come back to what you're talking about in terms of positivity. We need to push the mantra. We've got to get people to say, I am optimistic.
Yes.
Ask them to ask their teams why they're optimistic.
Absolutely.
Ask their teams what they mean when they say not too bad. And I'm really happy to collaborate with you because, as I said, just watching the work you do on a daily basis, to hear what Melissa said about your work, I'm like you, I'm a natural collaborator, and both of us are pushing the message that people need to be optimistic, need to be using positive language. If I can just take one more minute, I've got a friend who's set up a system for bypassing politics and politicians. And he's a lovely guy and he wants to reform democracy. The only problem is when I see him on Twitter, his language is even worse than the language that the politicians use.
Absolutely.
And I keep saying to him, what are you doing? If you're trying to create a better form of politics, you need to use a better form of language. Use positive language for positive change. Don't use the same negative language that the television news uses and that the politicians use. Now, maybe one more trick for your listeners and podcast viewers, Tanya, is I've stopped watching the news before or listening to the news before 9 in the morning.
Me too.
It just drags you down. And they're lovely people. You meet them at dinner parties or conferences.
Yeah.
All of the hosts and the editors are lovely people, but they're like Jekyll and Hyde. When they get into the editing room, they've got 30 or 40,000 stories that they could put on any day's news, but they choose murder and mayhem and arson and fire from all around the world, and I think it's wrong. So I call that the pessimist industry.
Yes.
You and I, Tanya, and our friends and colleagues, we are the optimist sector. We are lifting the economy, we're lifting the country, and we will help to lift the world.
We will. That's fantastic. It was really interesting because as you were talking, I got an image of the television and the news, and I was going to ask you what your take is on that. It's very interesting. Obviously, negative headlines sell, if I sent you a text message, Victor, and it was in all capital letters, you would interpret that I was yelling at you. Yet every single day we are yelled at by the front cover of the paper because there it is in big, bold, black letters. And I know that, people want to be informed. They want to know what's happening around the world. But to your point, if we've got a choice of focusing on, what's going to make that positive difference and what's going to affect, set us up for the day. I think a lot of people in cafes in the morning with their coffee are frowning rather than smiling as they read that paper. And, it does, it definitely affects us. So really good call, and I'm with you on that. I'd like to share a couple of things too if we've got a few more minutes. I had a really interesting experience a few years ago where my father had a stroke. And the story goes that he had a pretty hectic day, and he was just at the dinner table with my mum and my nephew, and he keeled over. Fortunately, he was fine. My nephew responded. The ambulance came. He was okay. It was quite a harrowing experience. But I did a follow-up with him, with the neurologist, and it was a very interesting experience for me. And here I have been preaching positivity, preaching positive dialogue, inner dialogue, managing mood, making choice about how we communicate. It's not what you say, how you say it, those things. And my father's Mediterranean, so he's, pretty expressive, hot-blooded kind of guy. And the neurologist said this to him. He said, Paul, we're all going to die. But this is the thing. If you react and you have a negative reaction to something and you allow yourself to get really, upset, your body will just produce all these chemicals that will literally harden your arteries. And that's actually what happened. You'd had a heavy day, your arteries hardened, and the blood flow was stopped in your neck to your brain. That's what happened. On the other hand, if you breathe, you think happy thoughts, you think about what it is you want to communicate, you respond and you don't react. Your body actually produces another round of chemicals which help to keep the blood flowing and soften your arteries, and that will prolong your life. So you get to choose, you get to help contribute to when you're going to leave the planet.
That's absolutely brilliant. And in fact, one of the chapters in my book refers to the research by Harvard University and a number of other universities that now demonstrate clearly that people who are optimistic recover from any condition better than others.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Buddhists would talk about detachment, and I think detachment is hard for people to understand because they think it's unfeeling or uncaring.
Yeah.
But the optimist understands that shit happens.
Yeah.
Right? That things will go wrong, that Along the way, people will make mistakes in the workforce or elsewhere, but knows that you just go on. You don't need to yell at anyone. You don't need to shout at anyone. You just keep going. And the lesson, by the way, did Paul accept the advice of the neurologist?
He's doing his best, Victor. He's doing his best with a bit of coaching from number one daughter.
Well, it's you've done very well. You've done very well. So but that the health side of being optimistic, of the gratitude exercises. I'm still surprised by the number of people who don't say thank you as a matter of course. And one of the tricks I use is Seligman's 3 blessings. And when I'm having dinner with my children, I will get them to do it. And they're so used to it now. They say, oh, well, we haven't done that yet. We can't leave the table till it's done. But this notion of having a look at what was good in the day rather than what was bad in the day. And, having that sort of conversation rather than watching the television news will lift your optimism. And look, my clippings today, there was an article by a professor in Pakistan who said that there was this meeting between the head of Afghanistan, the head of Pakistan, and the body language was so optimistic that he thought there was great hope for Pakistan. But all you and I see on Channel 2 or Channel 7 or on the news is another suicide bombing or another shooting, because 2 leaders meeting and having great body language doesn't translate to something that confronts. And, it's actually quite the television news uses psychology to divert people. It's a bit like a gaming machine industry. So people don't actually necessarily want bad news, but you flash a piece of bad news in front of them, it sparks curiosity, that fight or flee instinct of the mammal, and that's what they use. They have little prompters half an hour before the news. Of something absolutely shocking will be revealed on our show. So it stimulates that curiosity, but it's not necessarily what people want as a matter of course. And, it's the same industry that produces poker machines and gambling and the like. And one of the greatest ironies for me the other day, you and I both come from non-English speaking backgrounds, is I was watching SBS the other day and they're having a promo for their news and saying, we're going to tell you all about how the gaming companies target ethnics to get them to gamble. And a minute later, they had an advertisement for the tab, shocking, luring of people to go out and gamble immediately. So, how can you be serious about wanting to fight gambling when you're showing ads that help to addict people?
I know, Victor, it's crazy. Look, what a blessing to talk to you. I'm so grateful. I'd like to propose a couple of things. Number one, that we do this again, and perhaps we have a series of topics that we're talking about that can open up the dialogue. And number two, that we have that offline and discuss the possibilities. I know that we could really take this in many directions, from international culture to the media, and how we can improve and influence in our own workplaces. So I've loved this conversation. Thank you very much for all your work and for leading the charge in such a really powerful and profound way. And I know that you're doing a lot of work on LinkedIn. So that there's that group on LinkedIn. And if people want to get the book or find out more about your work, I will include some links, but do you want to just tell them where would be the best place to?
Well, the easiest thing is to go to my website, because there's links to the Leadership Project, the Optimism book. They can pick up the Optimism book from Amazon, or they can order it online, or they can pick it up from the Avenue bookstore. But the best place to go is victorperton.com. So just my name, Victor, Victor, surname Perton, Perton.com, and they'll find me and they'll find my work. And I can also commend to them those that aren't on Facebook and following your group there. It's vibrant and it's positive and it's a great community. And you are doing great work for the world and each one of your clients.
Wow. Thank you, Victor. I really, really appreciate this time with you. It's really great. So we'll sign off now. So for those of you who'd like to find out a little bit more, you can definitely just even Google Victor's name. You're going to find him with Optimism, Australian Leadership, and in LinkedIn groups, and his domain name and his in his website, victorperton.com. And thank you for joining us on the Positivity Show. Tanya Lacey Online, signing off, and keep it positive. Keep it positive and keep it real. Bye for now. Thanks, Victor.
Thank you, Tanya. Brilliant.